Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Chag Sameach, everybody. And thank you for welcoming me to Columbia. Columbia hasn't always been so welcoming to me. In 1955, I applied for admission, and I was put on the wait list and didn't make it off the wait list, and went to Brooklyn College. I'm sure all my educational gaps, of which there are many, would have been filled had I been able to attend Columbia University. And the last time I came here, there was not a single faculty member that was prepared to introduce me because I was making a pro-Israel speech, and I'm so thrilled that today we have distinguished Professor Jacobson, who's done so much on behalf of pro-Israel advocacy on this campus and around the world, introducing me. So I personally thank you for doing that. I'm also thrilled to be in the Bob Kraft building, because Bob's a good friend of mine. And I do have to say, because it's Bob Kraft, go Patriots. They're playing right now. And so are the Giants, but, you know, the owners of the Giants and the Jets didn't name this building. So we have to show our loyalties. I was a little uncomfortable being asked simply to come here as the result of Chomsky being invited, but then I thought about it. It's the right response. I would have much preferred to debate Chomsky. I have debated him in every decade since 1970, but not this one. And since my last debate with him, which you can see on YouTube, in which I challenged the students to go home and check all of the following statements of fact that he had made, and then each of us got dozens and dozens of emails expressing shock at the absolute fabrications that Chomsky had put forward, among them that Israel didn't accept Resolution 242 of the UN after 1967 and the Palestinians did. Just total lie. Palestinians went to Khartoum and issued their three famous no's: no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. Israel accepted 242, indeed was probably involved in the process of drafting 242. Over and over again, Chomsky would invent statements and simply make them up, many of them coming from foreign newspapers. At one point, he quoted a Turkish newspaper. Fortunately, I had students who read Turkish, and it just was made up. And he's just made it up repeatedly to the point where I accused him of living on Planet Chomsky. And on Planet Chomsky, the truth is not held in high regard. So I urge you, please, all of you, to attend Chomsky's talk and to ask him hard questions, and to check his facts. And you will find that many of them simply don't meet the test of truth. Chomsky is not the only person who won't debate me. I had a virtual debate with President Carter after he wrote his book. He was invited to Brandeis University, and the president of Brandeis invited him to debate me. He said, no, I won't debate Dershowitz. Dershowitz doesn't know anything about the Middle East. And then the president of Brandeis said, well, how about having a conversation with him that I will moderate? No, I won't sit in conversation with him. So to its credit, Brandeis University invited me to speak immediately after he spoke. He left the stage and wouldn't be on the same stage with me, but there was a virtual debate, and C-SPAN ran it as a virtual debate. So here we have second best to a real debate, a virtual debate. Walton Mearsheimer also. I challenged them to debate me on their book, The Israel Lobby, and they have refused to do that as well. And they go around the world telling everybody that nobody has read their book and is willing to debate them. Well, I've read every word of it, and I wrote a 50-page response, and I'm anxious to debate them. I've issued another challenge to debate them just yesterday, to debate Mearsheimer, because John Mearsheimer has just written an endorsement of a book by Gilad Atzmon, who was a self-declared anti-Semite, self-declared Jewish self-hater, and all-around bigot. And John Mearsheimer has endorsed this book, and I have challenged Mearsheimer to debate his endorsement. But you find a lot of anti-Israel speakers are really not prepared to engage in dialogue and debate. So I welcome the fact that you have invited me to, in anticipation of Chomsky, give you some views that you might want to use in confronting Chomsky when he's here tomorrow. First, let's talk a little bit about peace. Not long ago, I was invited to Ramallah to spend the afternoon with Prime Minister Fayyad of the Palestinian Authority, a very decent man, very well-educated man, and a man of peace, a man who believes in nation building. He had several books on his shelf. One of them I'm sure he put there just because he knew I was coming. It was The Case for Israel, and he told me he'd read that book and admired it. The other was a biography of Ben-Gurion, who he said he admired enormously, and another was a biography of probably the most distinguished Columbia graduate in history, Alexander Hamilton. He admired Hamilton because Hamilton was also a nation builder, never held high office, but built the country from the top down. He wouldn't be pleased at the Wall Street demonstrations that are going on today, but he helped build banks, he helped build industry. He had the enormous foresight to see that America should not be a Jeffersonian agricultural country, but rather an industrial giant with natural resources. And Fayyad and I had a long discussion about peace. It started as a very short discussion because he asked me to spell out what I thought a reasonable peace would be. And I repeated what I had been saying since 1967 and in print since 1970, favoring a two-state solution in which Israel is recognized as the nation-state of the Jewish people, Palestine is recognized as the nation-state of the Palestinian people, that Israel holds on to those areas that it captured in the defense of 1967 war that are necessary to its security, which Resolution 242 of the UN proposed. That, of course, it hold on to the Kotel and the Jewish Quarter and the access road to Jerusalem, and that for other areas like Ma'ale Adumim and Gilo and areas that can honestly be called settlements, that there be acre for acre land swaps, that there be mutual recognition of refugee problems, 700,000 Jewish refugees who were expelled or made to leave Arab countries, leaving behind billions of dollars worth of wealth accumulated over 3,500 years, as well as the situation of many Palestinian refugees who were forced, some by Israel, some by their own leaders, some by circumstances, to leave in 1947, 48, 67, and that there be mutual recognition, but mutual acceptance that basically a population shift had occurred. There'd be some humanitarian reunifications permitted, but basically a right of return would be a right of Palestinians to return to the nation of Palestine. After all, why wouldn't any patriotic Palestinian not want to help build a Palestinian state? Why would a patriotic Palestinian want to move to Israel and become part of a minority rather than to move to Palestine and help build a great democratic secular society, which is what Fayyad wants to see built? That there would be all kinds of security measures that would be necessary to protect Israel, particularly after the Arab Spring. Nobody can predict what's going to happen in Syria. Nobody can predict what's going to happen in Jordan. Nobody could have predicted what happened in Tunisia and what happened in Egypt. And I was surprised to see how much of what I said he agreed with. Fayyad said, look, Israel is, in fact, the nation-state of the Jewish people. I don't think the Palestinians have to declare it to be the nation-state of the Jewish people. You declare it what you want to declare it. We'll declare our state to be what we want to declare it. I said that would not constitute sufficient recognition because there are many in Israel who suspect deeply that there are others in Palestine, not you, Prime Minister Fayyad, who see a two-state solution as simply a step on the road to a one-state solution, and that if the Palestinians are required to recognize Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. By the way, you'll notice my formulation is a little different than the formulation often proposed by Israel. I don't like the concept of Israel as a Jewish state. I prefer the concept of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Jewish state suggests that Jewish modifies state and could connote a religious modification, whereas the nation-state of the Jewish people is a factual statement which is true, in much the same way that France is the nation-state of the French people, Germany the nation-state of the German people, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. By the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu told me he agreed with that formulation, although he alternates, sometimes uses nation-state of the Jewish people, sometimes uses Jewish state. Fayyad said that that's a negotiating position, and that would be something subject to a negotiation. there was very little disagreement about Jerusalem. Obviously, Jews don't want to control large Palestinian areas of Jerusalem, but everybody would like to see Jerusalem remain more or less a united city with joint capitals. I think in the end, Ramallah will be the functioning capital of any Palestinian state. If any of you have been to Ramallah, it is beautiful, it is industrious, it is wealthy, high-tech stores, fancy cars, beautiful buildings. It certainly has one of the highest GNPs anywhere in the Middle East these days, and it looks like a very, very progressive place. It will be the Tel Aviv of a Palestine state, and Jerusalem will be the Jerusalem of a Palestine state. So there was an enormous disagreement about what the end result would probably look like. The problem is how to get there. The problem is how to sit down and begin negotiating. And Chomsky will tell you that Israel has refused to make peace since the beginning of its history. It's just not the case. If one looks back at any history, even some of the Palestinian histories, one will see very proudly boasting among many Palestinians that when the Peel Commission proposed the division of the mandate into a tiny little non-contiguous Jewish state and a very large Arab state, they never used the term Palestinian in those days, the Jewish Yishuv accepted it reluctantly, and some didn't. Jabotinsky didn't, and Begin didn't, but the Jewish establishment did. Ben Gurion did. The Palestinians did not. Haj al-Husseini, the head of the Palestinians, the leader of the Palestinians, said, "We don't want a Palestinian state. There is no such thing as Palestinians. We are Southern Syrians. We are part of the Arab world. We just don't want there to be a Jewish state." That's in the Peel Commission testimony. You can simply find it by Googling it or going to the library and reading the Peel Commission testimony. The same thing happened, of course, in 1967. When Israel accepted the UN partition plan, the Palestinians said no, and 5 Arab countries invaded Israel. In 67, Israel offered to trade land for peace. The Israelis sat by the phone waiting for Jordan to call, waiting for Egypt to call. There were no calls. There was a trip to Khartoum, the 3 no's. In 1990, the Oslo Accords. In 2000, 2001, in the 1990s, the Oslo Accords, 2000, 2001, the Camp David offers, which offered the Palestinians a contiguous state on 93 to 95% of the West Bank, and a divided Jerusalem and a $35 billion refugee package. Arafat said no, Israelis said yes. 2007, Omer offered the Palestinians even more, in my view a mistake. I don't think you ever offer more than what was rejected previously and responded to with violence. You don't reward violence by offering more. I think symbolically it's important actually to offer just a little bit less, but certainly no more. But Omer offered more, and the Palestinians simply did not respond. The current Palestinian administration simply did not respond. And I was with Benjamin Netanyahu at the United Nations, was it 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago on Friday, when 3 things happened of significance. Abbas got up and made one of the worst speeches I have ever heard a Palestinian leader deliver, certainly since the untimely death of Yasser Arafat. I always say untimely because if he had only died 3 years earlier, there might have been peace in the Middle East because the Palestinians might well have accepted the Camp David Taba offers. But since the death of Arafat, no Palestinian has made a worse speech than the one Abbas made at the UN. He did not recognize any Jewish presence in the land of Israel or Palestine since the beginning of time. He talked about Christians and Muslims being present. He opened up no doors to peace. He offered no opportunity for negotiation. And then the second event that occurred was Netanyahu got up and spoke. I don't agree with every word he said, but he certainly sent a message loud and clear. We want to negotiate now, right here at the UN, today, tomorrow. We're all in New York. No preconditions. You will get a generous peace offer. Simply come down and sit and negotiate. No preconditions. There had previously been a precondition, namely recognizing Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. He took that precondition off the table and said no preconditions, and the Palestinians rejected that offer of negotiation as well. So the hard question is how to get to where everybody knows we're ultimately going to get, if there's going to be, a two-state solution and real peace in the Middle East. So I have a colleague at Harvard Law School this year who certainly has all the credentials to speak for the Palestinians. He is a Lebanese. He represented the Palestinian people in the lawsuit against General Sharon going out of Sabra and Shatila. He holds a professorship which has to have the most unique name in the history of professorships. He is, quote, the custodian of the two holy mosques, visiting professor of Islamic legal studies. In other words, his professorship is the Mecca and Medina Mosque Professorship at Harvard. And he's a very distinguished, very, very pro-Palestinian intellectual. And the two of us have formulated a proposal that I wanted to briefly share with you, that we propose to send to, first publicize in the newspapers, and to send to the Security Council. This is the first time either of us has ever discussed this in public. But it calls for, this would be a Security Council resolution negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians, reiterating its vision of a region where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side, as expressed in Security Council resolution, etc., etc., inspired by the human rights revolutions afoot in the region, etc., recognizes, and this is a key, recognizes the state of Israel as the democratic state of the Jewish people with regard to the full equality of the Palestinians in the Israeli state. Obviously, that's the status quo. Israel is the democratic state of the Jewish people. And the state of Palestine as an Arab democratic state with full protection of non-Arabs and non-Muslims in the Palestinian state, along secure borders as defined by Resolution 242. And it says clearly, it is understood by all sides that the agreed upon borders will not be exactly the same as the June 1st, 1967 demarcation lines, and will be consistent with the recognition by 242 of the need to balance the requirement of secure, recognized boundaries free from threats and acts of force with the general principle of the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war. Calls for an immediate resumption of negotiations with no preconditions, notes the difficulties suffered by both Palestinian and Jewish refugees and Jewish settlers in the West Bank, calls for a committee, permanent committee, consisting of the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of the Palestinian state, to sit down and have accelerated talks leading to the implementation of this resolution with boundaries to be agreed upon in no longer than 5 years. And with security, a whole bunch of issues concerning security in the West Bank. Again, here you have two people representing two very different perspectives, but completely agreeing on what the end result should be. And the great tragedy is, as Netanyahu put it at the UN, it's time to stop negotiating about negotiating. And let's just sit down and negotiate this peace that the Israelis have wanted for so many years. And I think it's important not to be defensive about Israel's positions. Look, my own preference, any of you who've read my writings know this, I've been opposed to civilian settlements on the West Bank since 1973. I made my first public comments about it in 73, shortly before the Yomim Noraim, and my Rabbi Schwartz, in the Young Israel of Borough Park, on Rosh Hashanah, in front of my parents, called me a traitor to the Jewish people for opposing the establishment of Elan Moreh, a religious settlement, civilian settlement in the West Bank. That was my position then, that's my position now. In that respect, I don't disagree with Chomsky on that. I don't disagree with J Street on that aspect of Israel's policies. Do I think that the settlements have been the barrier to peace? Absolutely not. There were barriers to peace well before the settlements. There will be barriers to peace after the settlements. The best proof of that is Gaza is not at peace with Israel, and Israel has ended all settlements in Gaza, and there was no land for peace. What was exchanged was land for rockets and land for terrorism. And so the ultimate barrier to peace has always been the refusal of the Palestinian leadership to recognize the permanency of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. And when the Palestinians want their own state, more than they want there not to be a Jewish state, there will be a basis for a two-state solution. And that has been the major barrier to peace. You should be proud while being critical of Israel, just like you should be proud while being critical of the United States. You should be proud while being critical of Columbia University. You should be proud while being critical of the city and the state of New York. All of us are patriots to numerous institutions of which we are proud and of whose policies we are sometimes critical. What shocks me is the nature of the debate about Israel. People should be so proud of Israel's accomplishments. No country in history, none, has ever accomplished more for humanity in 63 years than Israel. None. No country has ever contributed more to the physical health of the planet in 63 years than Israel. I always wonder when I go to a place like Norway, where I was recently prevented from speaking by faculties in each of the 3 universities, what has Norway contributed in the last 63 years to the welfare of humankind to be lecturing Israel? They give a Nobel Prize, they don't get them. Israel gets them. Israel wins all kinds of awards in history. Israel has done more for the environment through its drip agriculture technology, through its electric car technology. And Israel has done more to teach the world how to balance fighting against terrorism with complying with the rule of law than any country in the world. When Justice Brennan, perhaps the most liberal justice in the history of the United States, went to Israel at the end of his life, and at the invitation of Aaron Barak, the president of the Israel Supreme Court, he came back saying, this is just before 9/11, if terrorism ever were to come to the United States, there's only one country from which the United States could learn how to balance civil liberties against the fight against terrorism, and that country is Israel. Think about what the United States is doing now, how it's fighting its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. What it's using is targeted killings, drones, to target specifically terrorists who endanger the freedom of the United States and the citizens of the United States. That technique was invented by Israel. When people say targeted killing, it's extrajudicial. Of course it is. Every military killing is extrajudicial. There's never been a stupider phrase than the phrase extrajudicial killing. Every military killing, every time you kill a fleeing felon, every time you shoot in self-defense, it's an extrajudicial killing. What Israel does complies with the rule of law. In fact, its decision by the Supreme Court, Barak's last decision before he left office, setting out the rules for when targeted killing are permissible, is far more restrictive than the rules of engagement adopted by the United States. Nonetheless, the United States has learned from Israel. Israel has taught them, not always perfectly, how to deal with terrorism. Israel has said it would never negotiate with terrorists, but of course, being a humanitarian society, it complies with the demands of its citizens. The recent exchange of over 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli soldier. I was asked today by Israeli radio, what should Israel have done? I said the answer is clear. Israel's a democracy. It should have done what the people wanted to do. That's what democracies do. And in a democracy, the family of Gilad Shalit has the right to use the media to try to make an emotional pitch against Israel, simply using a cost-benefit analysis. And that emotional pitch prevailed over what many of the military leaders wanted. It may not have been sensible from a cost-benefit analysis. But in a democracy, the people rule. And the people of Israel value the life of every single human being. When you compare that with the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah, Nasrallah, not so long ago said, we will win because you, the Israelis, love life and we love death. At a funeral not so long ago for a murdered terrorist leader, killed terrorist leader, a woman who is a literary editor in a Lebanese newspaper, a Palestinian woman, said that she has instructed each of her sons never to come home again. She wants them all to become suicide bombers. That's a different attitude than what the family of Gilad Shalit reflected. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Palestinians don't love their children, they do. Or that the people of Lebanon don't love their children, they do. Their leaders manipulate them into feeling guilty for not sacrificing their children in the name of a higher cause. It's the leaders, and the leaders never put their own lives at risk. They only put the lives of their followers at risk. And so we we really do have a very great difference in attitudes toward life and toward recovering soldiers and toward recovering bodies. And what I worry about is, look, there's a lot to debate in the Middle East. There's a lot to criticize about Israel's policies. Israel has made mistakes. It continues to make mistakes. It's a democracy. And democracies make mistakes all the time. Democracies don't act consistently because they act in accordance with the will of their public. And the will of the public is an ever-shifting will that varies over time. The Palestinians turned back the peace offers in 2000, 2001. The Israeli political system moved to the right. The peace movement was very seriously harmed as the result of Arafat's rejection. That's democracy in action. Let's continue to debate these issues in a rational, coherent manner. But the debates on university campuses today, for the most part, have ceased to be models of clarity, models of moderation, models of intellectual coherence. They have become extremist name-calling. When you see professors analogizing Israel to Nazi Germany, when you see professors saying that Israel has the worst human rights record in the world, those are just lies. Those are just categorical falsehoods. Nobody can believe that. Nobody can believe that what Israel is doing, no matter how extreme you may think it would be, is comparable to Auschwitz. When you get a guy like Gilad Atzmon apologizing to the Nazis because he said, I once compared Israel to the Nazis, and I've now concluded that Israel is far worse than the Nazis. And you get Professor Mearsheimer endorsing that view, and Professor Richard Falk of Princeton University endorsing that view. You know what's happened to the level of dialogue on university campuses. When Michael Oren, if any of you haven't heard him speak, you should invite him to come here to Columbia. He is a wonderful speaker. He was here last year, I hear. And he's such a moderate. He's such a centrist. And he's such a rational man. Was not allowed to speak at the University of California because students determined that he was not worthy of speaking, that his views should not be listened to, that he was a war criminal and therefore didn't have the right under the First Amendment to speak. And they tried to prevent him from speaking. And fortunately, they were stopped and arrested and properly convicted under the First Amendment of seeking to stop a speaker from speaking. The interests of the First Amendment are clearly on the side of the speaker and his audience. There is a right to heckle. Anybody here who wants to boo me is entitled to do that. But you're not entitled to try to stop me from speaking. And that's what's going on college and university campuses today. So let the dialogue continue. Let the challenges go forward. Every time a speaker comes and presents an anti-Israel point of view, present a moderate point of view, a centrist point of view. Let me tell you what happened when I got invited to speak at the University of California, Davis, and I'll end with this story. So I was invited a year before Michael Oren, and they tried to shout me down, and I'm just less polite than he is, and I shouted over them, and I just didn't let them shout me down. But once the audience was cleared of the disruptors who didn't really want to stay, they just wanted to disrupt, I then turned to the audience. There were about 1,000 people, and there were about 100 on one side wearing the green and the flags of the Palestinians, and on the other side there were about 100 wearing, kippot and blue and white. And I turned to the audience and said, about how many of you would you describe yourselves as pro-Israel? People on that side raised their hand. How many of you describe yourself as pro-Palestinian? Hands went up. I said, I want to ask the pro-Israel group, how many of you would accept a democratic, secular Palestine living in peace with Israel on the West Bank, inland, etc., etc.? Every single hand went up, almost immediately. I then asked how many of the pro-Palestinians would accept a non-expansionist Israel, non-violent Israel, living side by side. There was mumbling among them. Not a single hand went up. The debate was over. It was clear to the 800 people in the middle, this wasn't pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. It was pro-Israel, pro-Palestine on one side, anti-Israel, anti-Palestine, because they weren't so interested in there being a Palestinian state. They were just interested in there not being an Israeli state or a Jewish state on the other side. And so I think it's critically important that you appeal to the center. It's critically important that your arguments go to those who are undecided. You will never persuade Noam Chomsky. It's like you put your dollar in the soda machine and the dollar doesn't come out and the soda doesn't come out. You want to yell at the machine, you want to talk to the machine, nothing's going to help. You're tempted to kick the machine, don't do it. Don't try to talk to Chomsky. Try to use Chomsky's anti-Americanism, his anti-peace, his anti-generally values that we support. Use that to try to persuade the center. That's where the debate is. That's where the future leaders of the world are. When I look out at an audience like this, or when I look out at my own students, I don't just look out and see students. I see the future leaders. I see the future President of the United States. I see the future Chief Justice. I see the future, and I've taught them all. And I see the future of America. And those are the people that we have to try to at least leave this place with open minds. So it's your job to open their minds. It's your job to respond to bad speech with good speech. Never try to censor. Never try to shut down the debate. It's a show of weakness. It will never work. It never should work. Let the debate go forward. Answer with truth. Emet is our best weapon. Thank you.
I would say rightfully so, that's a tough act to follow, but thankfully I'm not following it. We're just having a conversation. Also, in the interest of open and free dialogue and conversation, I must say, I know we're in the Kraft Center, but I'm from Dallas, and the Patriots are playing the Cowboys today, so go Cowboys. Okay, so let's begin. Basically, this conversation, what we're going to talk about are some specific issues that are very topical today, some specific issues that speak to the conversations that we have on campus. And then we're also going to get into kind of the wider ranging issues of Zionism on campus in Israel. So let's just start off with probably the most topical issue related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today, and that's Gilad Shalit. So for those of you who don't know, it's been widely reported that Gilad Shalit was traded for, he was a prisoner held by Hamas, and then he was traded for 1,000 Israeli prisoners that had been convicted by Israel of terrorist activities. So I guess my question is, you spoke a little bit about this, and you've written about this lately, but what does this exchange, what does this imbalance almost say about the conflict, the wider conflict, and how do you think this might affect the peace talks and the conflict, the nature of Abbas's relationship with Hamas?
Well, it's very complicated. Number one, the big winner will be perceived to be Hamas. They will be perceived to have won in relation to Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. Some people, Haaretz had an article recently saying that was why Netanyahu agreed now, because he was trying to weaken Abbas in light of Abbas's efforts around the world to try to bring about this unilateral resolution at the UN without input from Israel. It weakens Israel's deterrent force because it sends a message to potential terrorists, don't worry, life imprisonment means 2 or 3 years until we can kidnap another Israeli soldier. It encourages kidnappings. It releases people who might very well be dangerous, although only about 400 of them were convicted really of directly being involved in killing activities, and many of them will not be allowed back on the West Bank. They will be put behind the walls in Gaza, where they're less of a threat, or sent to European countries, I don't know which ones will accept them, where I think actually they're more of a threat. I don't understand Israel's attitude about sending them out of the country where they can engage in terrorist actions. Out of the country, they're probably under greater supervision, at least of the Palestinian Authority, if they're on the West Bank. But it was a very difficult decision, and it was a decision that would not have been made by a country that wasn't a democracy. Countries that aren't democracies don't have to listen to their people. It is alleged that Ben-Gurion, I don't know that this is the case, but it's alleged that Ben-Gurion never was willing to speak to families of captured soldiers because he didn't want to become emotional. He wanted to do it on a pure cost-benefit analysis. On the other hand, in Israel, it's impossible for a prime minister today not to confront the family. I frequently visit Prime Minister Netanyahu when I'm in Israel, and every time I've done that since the capture of Shalom, you have to pass by this tent right in front of the Prime Minister's house, and family and friends are there 24 hours a day, and everybody who goes in to see the Prime Minister is told, please tell the Prime Minister, please tell the Prime Minister, and I always have to be very polite to these people and say, I'm not going to tell the Prime Minister. This is a decision that has to be made by the Israeli people. I am neither a potential victim of Israeli terrorism, nor are my children potential captives. This is a quintessentially Israeli decision, and I think as people who are not members or citizens of Israel, we have to just generally be supportive of the democratic process and not take sides as to how Israel comes down on issues that must be subject to democratic governance. I always get these right-wing emails from friends of mine saying, stop Israel from doing this, stop Israel. But they live in Queens, the people who are sending me these emails. You know, if they want to vote with their feet, they should make aliyah. But Israelis have to make this decision. I remember once having, this is a name drop conversation, but I remember once having a conversation with Bill Clinton when he was in the White House, and he said to me, you know, it takes time for every American president to realize that, damn it, Israel's a democracy, damn it. He said, I can just pick up the phone and call King Hussein. This is when King Hussein was king, tell him what to do. I can call Mubarak, tell him what to do. I can't call the Israeli Prime Minister and tell him what to do because the Israeli Prime Minister doesn't have the power to do it. People forget the Israeli Prime Minister doesn't even have the power of the American President. The Israeli Prime Minister is not the executive authority of Israel. He is not the commander-in-chief. He doesn't have the authority to declare war. He is only the prime minister among ministers. And decisions are made by the Israeli cabinet, which is the executive, subject to the approval. For example, I'll tell you a secret here. Bibi Netanyahu was very, very interested in having a freeze, a settlement freeze. The last thing he wanted was to embarrass himself by having buildings announced while he was having dinner with Vice President Biden. It was others who did that, and it was Lieberman who announced that if you have a settlement freeze for even 10 seconds, I'm going to quit the government and the government will fall. So it's very complicated in Israel, and American presidents and American critics of Israel have to understand the dynamics of the Israeli democracy. It's very different than democracy here.
All right, so I guess building on that question, you mentioned Avigdor Lieberman, who is very conservative and has politics that many liberals would find to be repulsive. So my question is, how does one who has a strong liberal identity, a supporter of equality, a supporter of human rights, how does one synthesize that with strident support of Israel and Zionism, especially on campus today?
Well, it's the same way one would support, I support, I'm a liberal Democrat. I support mostly liberal Democratic presidents, and usually I hate half the people they appoint to their cabinet because they always have to strike a balance. And they appoint some right-wingers and others who I disagree with. Lieberman is a complex figure. He represents the aliyah of Russian Jews who tend to be more conservative than the previous generations of Ashkenazi Jews. Lieberman himself is in fact favorable to peace. He always votes on the side of peace. He has his own idea of what Israel should look like ethnically and would like at some point to see a situation where the Palestinian residents of Israel should be allowed as part of a peace to vote to become part of a Palestinian state. That raises all kinds of complex issues that Israelis have to decide. And you can be pro-Israel and anti-Netanyahu. You can be pro-Israel and support any potential government. My own preference would be to see a national government, a more consensus government, perhaps with Tzipi Livni as foreign minister. But I'm not an Israeli, and I can't make those kinds of decisions. By the way, I'm not sure how different Tzipi Livni would be on some of these issues. She, after all, comes from a Mossad background. Her father was a very, very active right-wing member of the original Menachem Begin party. She is very tough. She presents a much better face to the world than Avigdor Lieberman does. And, you know, I think peace will come probably when Israel has a national government, a more consensus government. After all, it does have as its Minister of Defense now the former head of the Labour Party and the former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. So when you have in the same cabinet Ehud Barak and Avigdor Lieberman, you have to ask yourself, when you say I'm pro-Israel, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you are pro necessarily the particular government that's in power.
Great. So you mentioned American Jewry and how people who vote with their feet should be the ones who have the loudest voices in this conversation. So you had an opportunity actually last year to vote with your feet. You were offered a position to be Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, and you turned it down. So I guess I'm wondering why.
Well, it was probably the hardest decision I ever had to make. I mean, I was shocked when the Prime Minister of Israel not only asked me, Bibi doesn't ask, he tells. He says, Alan, you're going to be Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. You're the only person who can, you know, speak with clarity about Israel at the United Nations. You have to accept. I'm asking you as the Prime Minister of Israel. And I thought about it for a long time. My family was very split. One of my sons favored it. My other son and daughter didn't favor it. My wife didn't favor it. My own view would have been good for me, and it would have been bad for Israel, and it would have been bad for American Jewry, and that's why I declined it. My major consideration was that I think for a, quote, prominent American Jew to suddenly become an Israeli citizen and speak on behalf of Israel at the United Nations, particularly when it was in potential conflict with the United States on some issues, would have exaggerated the complaints of dual loyalty among many and would not have been good for American Jews. I am an American, and my own view is I will do what I can to support Israel as an American. I don't vote in American elections as an Israeli. I vote as an American. I vote for candidates who support a woman's right to choose. I vote for candidates who support gay marriage. I vote for candidates who support economic liberalism. And I vote for candidates who support Israel. Israel is very high on my list of priorities, but it's not the only factor on my list of priorities. There are many candidates today who are running who would be very pro-Israel, who I could not support as an American. And I felt that conflict very deeply. I could not have imagined a more interesting, fascinating culmination to my own personal career than going to the United Nations, but in the end, I did not think it would be good for Israel or good for the United States. So I asked Bibi, I can't do it, I said. He invited me to dinner at his house, and he twisted my arm, and he, you know, plied me with liquor, and he did all the things. And at the end, I think he agreed that I was right. And so I asked him, what can I do second? And, you know, he asked me if I would represent Israel in international bodies as a lawyer. And I will, if Israel were to be charged in the International Criminal Court for what happened in Gaza. I would serve as one of Israel's lawyers in the International Court. I can do that as an American lawyer. I've represented Macedonia. I've represented other countries in international bodies. I feel very comfortable doing that. And then he said, Alan, one other thing you can do. Help keep the American Jewish community strong. That's one of our biggest strengths in the world. And make sure, he used this term, make sure that support for Israel goes lador, medor lador, from generation to generation. That he's very worried that support for Israel is slipping on college campuses, and that the future leaders may not have the same kind of ahavat Yisrael deep in their hearts and souls that my generation, which remembers 48, remembers 67, remembers the Holocaust, remembers 73, remembers 76 Entebbe, remembers 81, the attack on the Osiris reactor, remembers Israel's heroic activities. Your generation, students, your memories of Israel tend to be much more contemporaneous, and you remember the occupation and the war in Lebanon and the war in Gaza and the demonstrations on campus. And it's much harder to be pro-Israel today. It's much harder to be a Jew today. You know, people always praise my generation. I love when people say, oh, your generation was the great Jewish generation. You all married Jews. Of course we did. Nobody else wanted to marry us. Today, everybody wants to marry a Jew, except apparently the other Jews. So you have a much greater challenge. You live in a completely assimilated society. You can do anything you want. In my day, my generation of students couldn't get into Wall Street. We couldn't work in Cravath, Swaine, and Moore law firms. We couldn't get into Princeton. We couldn't get into some of the medical schools and law schools. We couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. Your generation can do everything. You can meet everybody. You can date anybody. You will have to make choices in your life. You can be pro-Israel. You can be anti-Israel. You can ignore Israel. That's why your generation is in a much, much more challenging position. And you really have to dig deep into your own resources, emotional, to stand up to some of what you get on college campuses. The reason I wrote the case for Israel is it happened actually just at about this time of the year. A young student came to me during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and said to me, Professor Dershowitz, I need you to forgive me. I said, what for? He said, I'm very educated on Israel. He said, I went to Ramaz, I went to Camp Masad, or whatever camp he went to, and I went to, I know everything about Israel. I've been on Birthright. I never speak up. I said, why don't you speak up in class? Why don't you speak up when students make anti-Israel statements? He said, I'm embarrassed, and also, I'm afraid if I'm perceived as a Zionist, I won't have dates, I won't have friends. I started a little campaign at Harvard, support Israel, date a Zionist tonight. It helped a few Zionists, it didn't help Israel particularly. And it became clear to me that it wasn't cool anymore to be pro-Israel the way it was when I was a young student. And I decided to write the case for Israel to provide kind of at least ammunition to students to see the other side and to be able to argue back. You should be very, very proud of Israel. And when pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel people come to you and say, how can you support a country that does A, B, and C, in addition to saying, they don't often do the A, B, and C, look at the Palestinian Constitution. It says Palestine will be an Islamic state, that its legislation will be based primarily on the Sharia, which means women will not be able to have equal rights, gays will be persecuted. Look in the mirror. When people talk about how wonderful the Palestinian state will be, at the moment, it will be an apartheid state. It will be a Judenrein state. It will be a state that will not practice democracy. There are those who would like to see it become a secular democratic state, but they are clearly in the minority. Look at today's New York Times and see what's happening to Christians all over the Arab world. 100,000 Christians have left Egypt since Mubarak's downfall. There are no Christians left in Gaza to speak of. There are increasingly emigrating from the West Bank and from Lebanon, the wonderful Christian community that used to live in Lebanon. My own professor who I'm working with can't go back to Lebanon because he's a Maronite Christian and fears for his own life. Let those who put up checkpoints on university campuses to show Israel's imperfections, let them look in the collective mirror. Let them look at their own countries. Let them look at their own states. Let them look at their own causes. And let all of us look at the mirror and see what we can do to improve and increase democracy and equality in all the countries in the Middle East.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about speaking out and speaking up. You said that we shouldn't really try to kick the soda machine because the can of soda is never going to come out. Right. But as students, as Zionists, as people who are concerned about Israel, I believe that there's a strong impulse to do that when the loudest conversation about Israel on campus is being had by people like Students for Justice in Palestine, people like Noam Chomsky. How do we resist that impulse to kick the soda machine while still advocating,
it makes no sense to kick the machine. It makes no sense to try to outshout the other side. I think there are things that can be done. For example, every Friday on campus, somebody should be handing out a two-sided, nice colored leaflet handout which shows what Israel has done this week to save lives, what Israel has done this week to help people, what Israel has done this week to support the cause of feminism, of gay rights, of environmentalism, of all the causes. When I see Gays for Palestine on campus, it just shocks me. You know what happens to Gays for Palestine in Palestine? They go to Israel to seek asylum. Otherwise, they are lynched, they are murdered. The idea that gays don't know that Israel doesn't have a don't ask, don't tell policy in its own. Is it perfect to gays? No. Is New York perfect to gays? No. But every radical focus on Israel's imperfection to the extent of failing to notice what it has accomplished. So I think making the case for Israel constructively, proactively, using online services. You know, I'm a Luddite. All I know how to do is write books. And I know people don't read them anymore, so I make videos now. Even that's anachronistic. My secretary insisted that I now tweet. For about a month, I thought I was twitting. I didn't even know how to say the word. So everybody has to learn to use the social media to the best way possible and to make the case. Don't give up just because you're out-shouted. You know, you're out-shouted, but people don't listen to the loudest voices, and they don't listen to the most shrill voices. Everybody at Columbia University wants to succeed in life. They want to be on the right side. They want to do justice. And if you just persist in making the case, they will listen.
Let's try to get some Twitter followers for
okay.
Professor.
And by the way, your questions needn't be questions. They can be statements, and they can be very critical. And just limit them to 1 minute so as many people can ask questions as possible.
But should we? Okay, one more question. Okay, so I guess.
Okay, one more cue. I thought you were.
Yeah, we're gonna do that.
Okay.
There are a lot of issues at hand, but one thing that I think is interesting and that's recently come up in the context of Columbia, it's been mentioned, is the U.S. Department of Education's investigation by the Office of Civil Rights into a potential case of steering of a Barnard student away from a class taught by Joseph Mossad, who is a notoriously anti-Israel, and some say anti-Semitic professor. So this is kind of a one touchstone in the shift that we're seeing in Israel advocacy for some to pursue lawfare or legal actions against anti-Israel people. And we're also seeing on the other side with the Palestinian bid for statehood in the United Nations. So my question is the lawfare, is engaging the debate on a legal level instead of perhaps on the issue level like you do when you debate people, is that the most effective way that we should be spending our time?
I don't think so. I think that law is always a last resort. It's long, it's cumbersome. Often you don't get results on the merits, you get results that deal with the limitations on what agencies can do. I think it's far better to expose these kinds of things. Let's remember one thing clear. I'm a professor. I want to make 2 points about professors. Number one, professors have academic freedom, and so do students. And if anything, the academic freedom of students at a university is even more important than the academic freedom of professors. It is certainly no less important. And students have the right to express their views, not to be graded down for their views. Let me make one more point about professors. It's not going to make any friends among me. This is my 48th year of teaching at Harvard. I've had tenure for 45 years. I have never met a group of people in my last 48 years with less courage than tenured professors, as a group. Tenure is supposed to give you the right to speak out and the ability to speak out without fear of retaliation. Let me tell you what happens when I speak at university campuses. It happens everywhere I speak. Probably won't happen today because I'm expressing it in advance, but it would have happened. I get a call the next day, usually from people I know who are pro-Israel. And they will whisper to me on the phone saying, "Alan, thank you so much for speaking out on behalf of Israel. I wish I did it." "Why don't you do it?" "Well, you know, I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of? You have tenure." "Well, my students, my evaluations will go down. I'll lose popularity among my students." And by the way, it's true. It is absolutely true. I'm a very effective teacher, and I always get very, very high ratings by my students. When I became very public in my support for Israel, about 10% of my students gave me 0 ratings in everything. For example, I have lunch with every single student during the semester, and I invite every single student to my home for dinner at the end of the semester. I'm more accessible probably than almost any faculty member, and I'm well known for that at Harvard. Yet my evaluations at the end of the year when it comes to accessibility out of class, 10% will give me 0 out of 5. Because they're just trying to get even with me for being supportive of Israel. Now imagine if I were a young assistant professor and wanted to speak out on behalf of Israel, and I was worried that it might affect my tenure. So I can understand why assistant professors or untenured professors don't speak out. And my criticism is not against Chomsky. Chomsky speaks his conscience. My criticism is against pro-Israel professors who don't have the courage of their convictions to speak out. That's the biggest problem at Columbia. Believe me, you have dozens of pro-Israel professors on this campus who do not have the courage to speak out. And it's a scandal. And it's unacceptable. They have academic freedom only when they want academic freedom, but they don't exercise their academic freedom when it comes to important issues. And there's no more important moral issue in the 21st century than whether or not Israel's struggle to preserve itself against enemies will become yet the latest manifestation or excuse for the oldest of bigotries against Jews and against the Jewish people and against the Jewish nation. And the time has long passed for professors to speak out. Today we hear professors speaking out almost exclusively when they're against Israel, and very few speaking out when they support Israel.
All right, so we're going to go to questions. Eric's about to bring the mic to where it's supposed to be. So yeah, just line up for questions, and time permitting, we'll try to take as many as we can.
We're supposed to end at 5:05, so hold on a second. I'm also not going to that. Time permitted, please keep your comments and questions short, and hopefully we can get everyone.
Okay.
Professor Dershowitz,
Yeah.
you had mentioned the
In the mic. Yeah.
sorry, this is better. You had mentioned Prime Minister Fayyad. Prime Minister Fayyad is a Muslim. How can he say that he is for a secular state when Islam, his own faith, requires him to conquer the world and convert everything?
Okay, the question is how can a Muslim say he's for a secular state? Shimon Peres is a Jew, and he's for a secular state. People don't follow, thank God, people don't follow everything in their religion. If everybody who was Jewish followed every prescription in the Torah, any of you who were gay would be killed. Any of you who believed in witches would be executed, and any of you who were suspected of adultery by your husband would have to eat a concoction and be thrown into the water and see if you sink to the bottom. We pick and choose, obviously, and for years, Turkey was an Islamic secular society, so I think it's possible. Yeah, yeah.
Professor Dershowitz, this is probably a tough one.
Good.
What do we do about the dissension within the Jewish community on the pro-Israel issue? Now, we see the Occupy Wall Street protests are becoming more and more anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. We hear, statements coming from, from there that Jews are the new oligarchy. I just heard from an Arab Shiva reporter who was down there today and said 500 Jews were down there supporting OSW, supporting people, quoting people like Chomsky, Occupy Wall Street.
Let's keep the questions short.
Okay.
Okay, well here, anytime there is a mass group of people, you're going to find people from every particular persuasion. On Yom Kippur, there were progressive Jews who were supporting the criticism of Wall Street. There have been great efforts to try to prevent anti-Semitic statements and anti-Israel statements from infecting the Wall Street efforts. And we can't censor. What we have to do is make judgments. based on not a few people. There have clearly been, look, there have been neo-Nazis with swastikas. There have been communists with hammers and sickles. And there have been rabbis who have quoted from the Torah. This is an unorganized, disorganized group of people. And as a Jew, I've always been fearful of extremes. Jews have never thrived on the extreme left or right. They have been active on the extreme left, but it's never benefited Jews. There's a great article written after the Second World War entitled "Between the Black and the Red." And Jews historically have been caught between the black of fascism and the red of communism. And centrism is very important, and therefore it's an argument for trying to take control of the movement if possible, or be involved in the movement. I wait and see whether I'm going to support this movement or not. I don't know whether it's going to be a force for good or a force for bad. I keep my mind open, my ears open, and I think it's important to call out and identify any anti-Semitism that's there, and there's been some, but there's also been plenty of people who would be appalled by any anti-Semitism, and people who would be appalled by trying to turn this into an anti-Israel rally. In England, it has been always turned against Israel. Hopefully in New York and in Massachusetts and other places that won't happen. Yeah.
So 3 more questions, and again, try to keep them short, please.
Okay. In the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a movement. I know there were a number of people came to the United States doing this as well. They were selling land in parts of Palestine. And my understanding, maybe my understanding is wrong, but my understanding is that the neighborhood of Hillel is almost entirely purchased by Jews in the 1930s. And the area of Gush Etzion also was purchased by Jews in the 20s. I think that Gush Etzion was purchased in the 20s. And I'd just like you to comment on that, because these are considered settlements. As an attorney, what the legal situation would be about that?
The legal situation on settlements is very, very unclear. Obviously, Israel captured the land from Jordan in a defensive war. People forget that although Israel preemptively struck against the Egyptian and Syrian air forces, it did not move a single soldier into Jordan. In fact, it sent emissaries into Jordan, pleading with them not to attack and saying that if Jordan...
I'm sorry.
Let me answer my question.
I'm sorry, we're short for time, so we don't
This is a sovereignty. This is not a sovereignty.
I am answering the question, please. You asked it, I answer it. So, Jordan decided to attack Israel. Israel took the property in a defensive war. The legal status, from a sovereignty point of view, is disputed, because Jordan obviously doesn't want the land back. Jordan would have the right to try to get it back as the people. They have given that right to the Palestinian people. That's not so clear in their international law. A sovereignty is all that matters. Personal property doesn't matter. A sovereign country, as we all know, has the right to expropriate private property. So that issue is simply off the table. Just because somebody sold land to an Arab, say, in part of Israel, certainly they would not have the right to come back and claim it now. So beware of that argument. It's an extraordinarily dangerous one, and one that shouldn't be made, because it would hurt Israel more than it would help any of the settlers. This issue has to be resolved politically. It has to be resolved by compromise. Look, should any Jew ever be excluded from living in Hebron? My God, it's like excluding a Catholic from living in the Vatican, or excluding a Muslim from living in Mecca or Medina. Hebron is the birthplace of Judaism. Indeed, talk about buying land. Just look in the Torah and you'll see, it's, I think 2 weeks from now is Parsha. And you'll see that Abraham bought the land and insisted on paying for it to bury his wife in Hebron. So of course Jews have the right to live there. And any deal with the Palestinians should include the right of individual Jews to live there as Palestinian citizens, not as Israeli citizens or as residents in Palestine. So these issues can be resolved, but they're not going to be resolved based on deeds or keys. Palestinians have keys to their houses. That's not the way the issues are going to be resolved. They're going to be resolved on a macro level, not on a micro level.
I was wondering about this talk's title.
Yeah.
Careful read reveals a disparity. It doesn't say Israel and Palestine, nor Israelis and the Palestinians, but rather says Israel and the Palestinians. Is this distinction between the state name and its adjectively based counterpart meaningful?
It is, yes. I didn't write it, but I support it. Israel is a state. Palestinians are people who are seeking to become a state. So actually it's a perfect formulation, Israel and the Palestinians. Hopefully if we have this conversation in 5 years, it will be Israel and Palestine. But right now, it is Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have to obtain statehood. By the way, if you make a list of the countries, of the people in the world who deserve statehood, Palestinians would rank around Israel. They're not first. The Kurds are way, 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 way up above the Palestinians. There are more of them. They are far more oppressed. They've never been given an opportunity to have statehood. They have not used terrorism to the extent the Palestinians have. They were offered they were promised statehood by the Treaty of Spares. Their claim for statehood is so much higher than the state, but they're not lucky. They're just not lucky. If their enemies were the Jews, they would have a state by now. And the Palestinians are the luckiest people in the world. They have picked the right enemy.
Thank you again for your time. Sure. As an Israeli, I actually have two main concerns that I'd like you to address.
Sure.
The first one is, how can international law be viewed as impartial when we look at Security Council, general resolution, and all the resolutions that are so disproportional against Israel? And you said you'd be Israel's advocate of that. And the second
Let me
is...
answer the first one first. First of all, Security Council resolutions have generally not been all that unbalanced against Israel because the United States has a veto power at the Security Council. If you look at the Human Rights Council, I mean, it is a Human Wrongs Council. Look at who has been on it. It's been chaired by Syria. Iran is the head of the women's rights part of it. I mean, it is preposterous. Next, they're going to be, they actually want to be the head of gay rights, but there are no gays in Iran, so they couldn't qualify. And we know that because they said at Columbia University, so it has to be true. Look, the United Nations has been a disaster as a facilitator of peace. Think back just 1 year, 1975. Two things were happening in 1975 at the UN. In Cambodia, 3 to 5 million Cambodians were being murdered by Pol Pot in cold blood in the worst genocide since the end of the Second World War. Go through all of the UN papers in 1975. You will not see the word Cambodia mentioned once. Why? The UN was too busy debating whether Zionism was racism. Yeah. That was the focus of 1975. When 3 to 5 million people are being murdered, the United Nations is debating is Zionism is racism. The main problem of the United Nations has not been Israel. It's that Israel has been an excuse to prevent the UN from stopping genocides in Rwanda, in Darfur, in Cambodia, in so many other parts of the world. You know, whenever you start raising the point, genocide, Israel, as soon as you mention the word Israel, everything else is taken off the agenda. So every tyrannical regime in the world knows how to stop any inquiry into its own genocides, simply says, we're against Israel.
Maybe
and that's what the UN
you
has
as the
done.
ambassador. Maybe that's why we needed you as the ambassador.
Well, I wish I could do it. I wish I could in another life. Okay.
All right, wait, there's a guy behind you, so...
You had a second question.
Yeah,
just
my second concern at the time was about Israel's Palestinian Israeli Arabs,
right,
that I'm more concerned about than the Palestinian Arabs, and how Israel as a apartheid country actually left them beyond their parliament. So what are the demographic effects that you see in that sense, and how can they be even addressed?
Well, I think it's a wonderful thing that Israel has a minority population of 1.2 million Arabs that serve on the Supreme Court of Israel. Do you know that the 3 judges that sentenced the former president of Israel to prison, or convicted the former president of Israel for rape? And first of all, how many countries put their former presidents on trial for rape? And they convicted him, and it was the 3 judges were 1 Arab judge, a woman judge, and only 1 ordinary white Ashkenazi Israeli Jewish judge. So, I mean, Israel's Supreme Court has an Arab judge, the cabinet has Arab ministers. I sat next to an Arab minister not so long ago at a concert in Jerusalem where Daniel Birnbaum led a combined orchestra of Palestinians and Israelis and Jews and Muslims playing together. I mean, you know, let me tell you about an apartheid country. South Africa today is an apartheid country. I just came back to South Africa. I was appalled. I've been to South Africa numerous times. South Africa is an apartheid country today. Blacks and whites live absolutely separately. Blacks live in shanty towns, and whites live on high mountains and beautiful areas, and it's a black-dominated government. Let Bishop Tutu look in the mirror. Let him look at his own country and do something. Let him look at Zimbabwe. Let him look at some of the horrors that are going on in southern Africa today instead of calling Israel an apartheid country. Yeah.
I have a statement. A significant loyal Arab-Israeli population exists, seeking only for equal opportunity, lacking discrimination, and pursue professions and lives and families.
I agree with you completely.
And I'm an Arab-Israeli.
Yeah, well, I agree with you completely, and I think Israel has a way to go on that. You might know about the report that recently came out about 2 or 3 years ago by a former justice of the Supreme Court of Israel looking at the situation of Israeli Arabs and finding plenty of problems, de facto problems. They grow first out of the fact that Arab leaders don't want Arabs to serve in the Israeli army. And when you don't serve in the Israeli army, whether because you're a Haredi Jew or because you're an Arab, you lose many advantages of Israeli society, which flow to people who have served in the army. With peace will come an end to that, hopefully. There also has to be a change in land ownership policies. The Supreme Court has tried to bring them about. You can be a very strong supporter of Israel and be very critical of how Israel deals with its local Arab population, just as I'm a very strong supporter of the United States, and I'm very critical about how we have dealt historically with the black problem in America. Look, Martin Luther King's statue was unveiled 2 days ago, or yesterday, in Washington. I was at that speech in 1973, and I'm very proud of the progress that the United States has made since that time in 1973, but we have a long, 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 long way to go. We have a long way to go until we achieve total equality with women in our society in terms of glass ceilings. Believe me, on law firms there are still glass ceilings. At faculties there are still glass ceilings. We are far from a perfect society. Israel is far from a perfect society. Look at our immigration policies. Look what's going on now in Arizona and Florida and California in terms of the way we deal with our immigrants, particularly from Mexico. We bring them in to work our crops, then we deny them citizenship and treat them like criminals and try to deny their children an education. Every country has a problem with minority populations, Israel among them. So my message to you is keep criticizing Israel, keep criticizing America, keep criticizing every institution that you're part of. Criticism is a sign of love. You know, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And don't be indifferent to Israel. Become involved in it, in every aspect of its life. Go to visit, spend time there, work there, become involved, know all the facts. Never hesitate. A good lawyer never hesitates to make ignitions and acknowledgments about imperfections, but then present the big picture. And one thing that gives me a lot of encouragement is you. I mean, here you are. You're the leaders, you're the next generation, and the burden is now on you. Take it over and do a great job. Thank you.